Okay, so I just wanted to start by acknowledging that we are on the land of the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and we acknowledge their connections to land, sea, and community wherever everybody that's participating in this webinar may be. I'm on Whadjuk Noongar country in Perth, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be participating today. Okay, so for those of you who may not be familiar with our organisation, NEA-BPD, which stands for the National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder, we primarily aim to support families and carers of people living with a personality disorder, which can affect up to 17% of the population. There are many types of personality disorder, but BPD is one of the most commonly diagnosed. It is a complex diagnosis, and it can certainly wreak havoc not only for those living with it, but also for the people around them. We are a volunteer-run organisation, and we're supported by more than 200 volunteers right across Australia. And we're one of the 26 countries around the world that offers the free Family Connections program, which is a 12-week evidence-based program that provides skills and hope to family members and carers. This program is offered free to participants and is led by our volunteer leaders who generously give their time to support other families. We receive no government funding whatsoever and rely solely on the generosity of our families and supporters. So how tonight's going to work, we're going to hear from Lucas, and then at the end, if you've submitted questions, I will be asking them on your behalf. So a lot of the questions are quite similar, so it might come as sort of one amalgamated question. You can add additional questions to the chat. Just a reminder to please mute yourself as you come in. Sorry, that just threw me off there. Yeah, if you don't want to appear on the recording, please turn off your camera. So today's speaker is Lucas Cheney. He's a psychiatrist and has worked in the Victorian public health system since 2010, and as a psychiatrist for 10 of those years. And he spent 8 years working at Spectrum, the statewide service in Victoria for personality disorders and complex trauma. He was the Deputy Clinical Director at that service. He's recently become a private psychiatrist so that he can work with a broader range of people in the community. And he's particularly interested in understanding the intersection between personality, trauma, and neurodiversity. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to, sorry, and I also just want to acknowledge that we've got Stan Rogers, sorry, I've forgotten Stan's proper title, but he's on our board, and Megan Anderson, our CEO, here tonight as well. Okay, so Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and thanks everybody for coming out in the evening. I am very excited to be here to talk about something that I've been very interested in for years now, and that's the intersection of attachment, trauma, and neurodiversity. And as Jenny mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist. I've been in the specialty of psychiatry for over a decade, and I started off working at Spectrum, which is a publicly funded statewide service based in Melbourne, but serving all of Victoria. I started there as a trainee and then spent those 8 years working at Spectrum, in the end ending up in a leadership and management position. And really what Spectrum does, it's a unique service, although there are other models in states around Australia now that are similar, in that it's a service that's designed primarily to provide assessment and treatment services free of charge to people that have diagnoses of personality disorder or complex trauma. And so we would get referrals that would come in from all across Victoria and also from around the country. And it would come through an intake process that I was very closely involved in. And really one of the main parts of my role at Spectrum was in the assessment and the decision-making around what services might be best to meet somebody's needs. And that would mean that we were doing about 200 a year. Most of the time, the people that were being referred to our service had had recurrent and complex mental health issues. And in many cases, they'd had numbers of efforts to provide treatment that hadn't been as successful as we would have liked. When someone had an assessment with us, we were often making a decision about where they would go within Spectrum. And each of these acronyms you can see on the right here represent different clinics within Spectrum during the time I was there, including a mentalization-based therapy, a dialectical behavior therapy, an acceptance and commitment therapy clinic, and then the CCS one is a unique clinical service within Spectrum. It's a complex care service. And this was an amalgamation of our senior clinicians at Spectrum who worked in a flexible sort of way with people whose mental health challenges were the most complex and the most unresponsive to treatment measures. So I'm going to talk about BPD, but I assume that most of the people that would come to a talk like this have heard of BPD and understand the basics of what the criteria are. But the way that I generally understand BPD is that you can read the criteria, and this is the list of the 9 criteria that are in the DSM-5. And you can, but really what you can sort of sum it up as is that what this amounts to is challenges with how you feel about yourself and how you relate to other people. And that can play out in lots of different ways for people. But in some cases, these sort of issues can cause a level of distress and a level of difficulty in managing day-to-day life that can be very overwhelming and in some cases life-threatening. Now, the other diagnosis you'll see on the branding for Spectrum, and something we were thinking about more and more, is what's the relationship between BPD and this diagnosis of complex PTSD. Now, this term, complex PTSD, has been around since I started training, but it's only been formalized as an actual diagnosis within ICD-11, which is the European WHO manual. And that's only in the last couple of years that you can actually make a formal diagnosis of complex PTSD. What this diagnosis requires is that you have the core PTSD symptoms, the re-experiencing of a traumatic event, avoidance of anything that reminds you of it, and a heightened sense of threat that can involve a high level of anxiety. But the additional criteria when you're thinking about complex PTSD is that it has this additional impact of disturbing someone's, what they call self-organization, meaning that people have emotions that are unstable, they have problems relating to other people, and they feel negatively about themselves. And really, when I look at that, I say, okay, that sounds like the same thing at its core. And what we saw is that there are a lot of people who would technically meet criteria for both diagnoses. And certainly, in the time that I've been around, I've seen a lot of debate over whether or not BPD is a trauma disorder, even though there's quite clear evidence that there's a significant proportion of people with a diagnosis of BPD who do not have an identifiable history of trauma. So what I want you to imagine here is that this is little baby face me on the left here, looking at people that would come to our service and they have some sort of query about a diagnosis of personality disorder symptoms. And the way I read that really is that this is about interpersonal difficulties and trying to then see through those symptoms to think about what might actually be causing these issues. And the general sort of certainly the way I was trained is that we're looking for signs that somebody has difficulty with attachment. And attachment really is a broad term here to describe the relationships that people experience as they're growing up, the way that they experience their caregivers, the people around them. And then the other big area is any sort of history of trauma, and that these were often the things that might place somebody at a higher risk for developing BPD. But in the time that I was at Spectrum, and certainly in an ongoing sort of way now, I think that there's a third category that needs to be considered in anyone that has a diagnosis of personality disorder, and that's neurodiversity. Now, neurodiversity is a term that I think is still evolving. It was originally coined in 1998 by Judy Singer, who's a social worker and a proud Australian, who wrote her thesis about autism, and she actually coined the term neurodiversity. And the way that she was hoping that it might be used is as a way to describe variation in how a human brain functions. That can include social function, learning, attention, mood, the way that we perceive sensory information that comes in, other mental function. But really the primary thing that she was trying to get across is that this is not a pathological, but we're not saying that you're sick or that there's something wrong with you. It's more just about being able to appreciate that brains are different, that even though we have the same basic anatomy, that the way our brains work and the way that they interact with the environment varies from person to person, and it can vary quite significantly. And so now we've got this sort of explosion of this term into popular consciousness, but I think that we're still trying to get our heads around what it means, where the boundaries are, if there are any, and whether or not it's a clinical thing that we need to be considering in a diagnostic sort of way, or if it's more just about terminology that helps people appreciate diversity in the way that people perceive the world. Now, I think you could go through each of these and you could have a whole series of lectures, you could have a big discussion about it. But I think for this audience, and certainly the thing I get asked about the most often, I'm going to focus on these two diagnostic categories: autism spectrum and ADHD. Before I go into talking about those two diagnostic categories, I want to just talk a little bit about the latest neuroscience, because I think that it's very important to have an understanding about what science is telling us about what a brain does at a very basic level. Because I think it has very significant implications for understanding what neurodiversity is. So in the past, people would have thought of the brain as functioning like a calculator. And the idea is that information comes into the brain, it's processed, and then you're given the experience of consciousness as an output. And so in a way, it's sort of like information in and the same response out, like how a calculator works. You put the numbers in and then you hit enter and it gives you a response. But that's not actually really how the brain works. That's much closer to how your heart works. Your heart gets very basic information about how hard you're working, about whether or not you're experiencing anxiety, and it speeds up or slows down in response to that information. It is very much information comes into the system, and then there's an output back in the form of how fast your heart is beating. The brain's quite different. The brain, it seems increasingly, is not so much responding to the environment as it is actually making predictions about the world. And so it's not sitting there just waiting for information to come in. It's actually forecasting into the future all the time based on your prior experience. And so if I can give you another way of thinking about how the brain works, it's like a weather forecast. So when you look at an image like this is taking a huge amount of information, tides, wind patterns, high pressure, low pressure systems, historical data about how the weather functions. And then it's just giving you information that you need to make a decision that's relevant to your life. So in this case, whether or not you need to take an umbrella when you leave the house that day. And this is much closer to what a brain is doing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a few examples to try and illustrate what I'm talking about. So the first one here, you're going to see that this piece of paper appears to change colors as it moves from the shade and into the light. Some of you may have seen this before. It's quite a common, what they call an optical illusion, but it's not really an illusion at all. What's happening here is that your brain has an understanding that things that are in shade are going to be darker. And so as a way to compensate for that darkness, your brain is turning up the brightness of the piece of paper as it moves into the shade. And so it's not just accepting that this is these conditions, it's actually interpreting them. It's saying, okay, that piece of paper needs to have the color turned down when it's in the light, and it needs to have it turned up when it's in the dark. I'm going to show you another example with a different sensory modality now.
Have you ever been someplace noisy with a friend, maybe a bar or a concert, and they said something to you that you didn't understand? Maybe it sounded something like this. It was pretty hard to understand, right? But what if we heard a clean version of that sound?
If this doesn't work, it'll be really embarrassing.
You can understand it easily. So what would happen if we replayed the garbled version again? I'll bet you could understand it this time. The words just popped out at you. So why is this? We conducted the same experiment in order to answer this question. The first time that we played the garbled sentence, we didn't see very much activity in parts of the subject's brain that are associated with sound or understanding speech. The second time that they heard the garbled sentence, after they had heard the clean sentence, we saw a very different pattern emerge. What we found was that your brain actually changes the way that it focuses on different parts of the sound. This allows it to understand this garbled speech sentence, even though it couldn't understand it the first time. This is really important because one of the biggest tasks that your brain has is in filtering out all of the noise that's present in the world around it. And what we showed was evidence that your brain is using its previous experience with sound in order to make this happen.
So that's an example of using sound. And again, the thing I'd emphasize here is that your brain is using previous experience to then predict into the future. And that actually alters the way that you experience reality. I'm going to go back to the visual system again, just for a couple more examples. Now, when you look at this picture, the first time I looked at this, I couldn't see anything in this picture. But now, having had another piece of information about it, I find it's hard for me to imagine that I couldn't see what's actually there before. But if you take this, try to pick out anything that would give you a sense about what this is. If you can tell now, you can write it in the comments. I'll be very impressed. But if I show you the actual original image, and then I take you back to that image, I would expect that it just pops out at you. And the thing that I find fascinating about this is that I don't think I could ever unsee the frog after having seen this picture. It just seems obvious now. The other example that you may have seen is this viral picture. This is the dress, and it's quite a few years ago now. But if you take this picture and you show it to different people, they will say that this dress is different colors. Some people will say that it's blue and black. Others will say that it's white and gold. And again, to me, this is a really clear indication that not only is our perception of reality not quite what we think it is, but that it can vary from one person to another. And to me, I think that this is one of the clearest ways of trying to understand from a neuroscience perspective what neurodiversity really is. It's about a difference in the way that we perceive the world. Okay, so how is this in any way relevant to thinking about BPD? Well, I think that if you look at BPD symptoms, like say this blue box at the top here, is people that would meet criteria for a diagnosis of personality disorder. We know that this green box, it represents people's baseline risk of developing BPD throughout their life. And it's thought that about 50% of somebody's chance of developing BPD is related to inheritance, that you've inherited genes which make you more or less likely to develop BPD. This arrow here would represent the experiences that somebody has throughout their life. And so this could be difficulties with attachment, it could be some form of trauma, but it's something that takes this baseline risk of developing BPD and it then pushes someone up into the realm of actually expressing symptoms of BPD. What I've certainly observed is that there are some people whose baseline risk is lower. And so that even if they have a similar sort of environmental or life experience, they don't express BPD symptoms. But I think that there's a group of people whose baseline risk of developing BPD is so high that even relatively minor experiences in life can lead to the expression of BPD symptoms. And I generally think that it falls into these three major categories in terms of thinking about this risk profile. All right, so that's sort of what's in my head now when I'm seeing somebody who we're thinking about BPD is, okay, how much of a relative contributing factor is each one of these three things, that attachment, the trauma and that neurodiversity. Now I'm going to talk specifically about autism. Now, autism is a neurodevelopmental variation that is, if you look at the diagnostic criteria, includes difficulty in 3 primary areas. One being social interaction, the other being difficulty in communication, and the third being behavioral flexibility. You'll hear the word Asperger's still being used, but that's technically not a diagnosis anymore. But that was used previously to describe people that don't have any language delay or intellectual disability, which is actually the majority of people with autism. It's thought that around 60% of people with autism do not have any intellectual or cognitive impairment. At the moment, one of the challenges we have is that there's a lot of interest out there in the public, a big surge in people considering whether or not autism is a diagnosis that's relevant to their situation or the situation of someone that they're supporting. And there's challenges because the diagnosis is still defined by behavior and is relying on current presentation and developmental history. So when you're diagnosing autism, you're relying on the expertise of the clinician that's seeing the person. We don't have a blood test, there's no brain scan yet. I think that eventually there will be more specific diagnostic testing, but we don't have it at the moment. And so it creates this challenge because there can be this debate about what is not autism, where the line is if there is one. It's very complicated. What we do know is that there tends to be autism tends to be diagnosed more often in boys than in girls. This is thought to be related to the way that the diagnosis of autism was originally created. So the diagnosis is like 100 years old now. And it was originally created around a small group of boys that were in a clinical setting and had a very specific clinical presentation. Again, one of the challenges we've got now is that the boundaries of what autism includes has expanded. And what we understand is that the actual true gender distribution of autism may be more even, but that there's a bias towards diagnosing boys in particular because those original ideas of what autism is were based on a group of boys. And that we see that that bias gets even bigger if somebody doesn't have a cognitive impairment or a language impairment. And so in that case, what seems to be happening is that women or females are being underdiagnosed with autism because they don't fit the classical sort of picture. And the literature has started to catch up with this. So the science has started to establish a general sort of picture about what autism might look like in women. And some of the characteristics that they point to are that there's a desire for social engagement. There's a tendency to be mothered by a peer group in primary school, but then when the social stakes go up in high school, that the bullying can be merciless. There's a tendency to want to fit in and to copy the behaviors of other people, and that they can do it really quite well because they have strong language skills and can have insight into what other people are doing. There can be restricted interests, but those restricted interests may involve things which are considered to be socially acceptable, such as pop stars, other things that don't necessarily stand out to people as much. But there can be an aspect of being very determined and having a lot of attention to detail that can result in quite significant risks if thoughts of self-injury or suicide start to creep into the picture. What we know is that regardless of gender, that autistic people suffer 10 times the rate of PTSD compared to the general population. This is thought to be related not only to autistic people being more vulnerable to experiencing trauma throughout their lives, but also because it may be more difficult for them to process or to come to terms with that trauma. I think that it can also be difficult for neurotypical people to imagine sometimes that some things which may be traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another, and that it can be difficult to understand each other across a significant divergence in the way that our brains work. But certainly the thing that was on my mind very often when I was working at Spectrum with people that were at high risk of suicide is that there's a well-identified higher risk of death by suicide in autistic people. And so I was explaining to Jenny and the board and EAPD before this started that I've been very interested in this particular area for years now, and I've published a couple things about it. The one that came out most recently is just a couple of months ago. But I'm going to talk through this one on the left. That this was actually this is a case report or sort of a case review of someone I worked with over 5 years. But I'm going to talk that one through. But I think that one of the things that I want to really highlight before I move on is just how diverse autism can be. So this is a very busy slide. You don't necessarily have to read every word of it. But what I want to highlight here is that each one of these categories, the sort of the big writing at the top here, describes a domain of brain function. It's basically one of the things your brain can do. And it's one of the places that your brain can vary compared to other people. And that one autistic person is not the same as another. So if you meet an autistic person, you may find that they have sensory sensitivities. They may find that certain textures or light or sound is very challenging, or they may have a strong preference, like they really prefer certain textures, but that could be completely different for someone else that's been diagnosed with autism. And that if you took each one of these categories, so language, social awareness, special interests, receiving information and processing it, behaviors that are repetitive, all these things, they can vary from one person to another, and there's no common pattern. So one can be high, the other can be low, the other can be in the middle, and that you won't really have an understanding about the specific strengths and relative areas of need of an autistic person unless you examine it very closely. And I'm going to give you an example. So I would imagine you might recognize one of these people. So on the right is Hollywood actor extraordinaire Channing Tatum. And on the left, if you haven't heard of her, this is Kylie Fleischman. Kylie is autistic, and she does not have any language. And I think Carly's story is really remarkable because for the first years of her life, everyone around her thought that she didn't have any understanding of language. She can't speak, but everyone then just assumed that meant that she didn't understand what people were saying and what was going on around her. And I'm going to show you a video to demonstrate that is not actually the case. So I'll just show you a couple minutes.
I would like to introduce you to my first guest ever. He has been a stripper, a police officer, a secret agent, a reporter, a boyfriend to many, and soon he will dump his wife to be with me. Welcome, Channing Tatum.
Hi.
How about that, Channing? Would you date a 21-year-old person with autism?
Yes, if I got permission from my wife.
All right, I've got my lawyers working on your divorce papers as we speak. Now, even though I'm in love with you, I do realize you are married. You've been very candid about how she is your everything. If she likes fairies, then you believe that fairies exist. Well, one thing does she believe in that she don't buy into as of yet?
There's these like things that she buys at like what's called the Aura shop in Santa Monica. They have like BBs in them, and they're supposed to like I have really no idea. I just go, that one I can't get into that one.
Rumor has it that when you were a child living at home, you used to sneak out of the house. Now I live as a perfect young lady. I never threw a party without my parents knowing, and I never snuck out of the house without telling them.
I think that's probably all you would really need to get a sense that Carly, not only does she understand language, but she has an understanding of social nuance, sarcasm, humor that would rival anybody out there. But what I think is amazing about her story is that in a way it was sort of trapped behind this difficulty with language to the point that no one could appreciate it until somebody put a keyboard in front of her that allowed her to communicate like that. All right. All right, so I'm going to leave autism and I'm going to move on to ADHD. ADHD is another thing that we've just seen this tidal wave of interest. I mean, it's not a new diagnosis, but it just seems to be everywhere now. The things that I would want to get across to everybody in this audience without, this lecture or this discussion being focused purely on ADHD is that it's very heritable. The only thing that's more heritable than ADHD when it comes to psychiatric diagnoses is autism. Autism is thought to be 90% heritable. ADHD is right behind it at 70 to 80% of the occurrence of ADHD is thought to be because you've inherited genes that place you at a higher risk. But we also know that this second point here, this is sort of I should probably cut this down. It's a long-winded way of saying is that the environment influences the expression of those ADHD symptoms. And so they can get worse or they can get more prominent if you have adverse experiences. But the literature is increasingly clear that even at a baseline, if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, you're at a much higher risk of developing BPD. Now, there's mounting evidence about the use of stimulants, which are the primary medication used to treat ADHD in people that have a diagnosis of both ADHD and BPD. I'm going to focus on just this one figure because I think it's one of the most important studies to know about. This is a large population retrospective study from Sweden. So they have these massive registers in Scandinavia where they keep track of all these health outcomes. They looked at 22,000 people who had a diagnosis of BPD, and then they looked at the medications that people were on and compared it to rates of attempted suicide and actually dying of suicide. And this is a sort of a fancy looking graph, but basically these little squares and lines over here, if they're to the right of the vertical line, then there were more suicide attempts when the people were on those medications. And if they're to the left of the line, then there's less suicide attempts. And really the only thing I'd want to highlight here is that the only medication that's fully left of the line is ADHD medications. And so the authors basically concluded that if people have symptoms of ADHD and they have BPD, that ADHD should be treated. All right, so that's a very brief look at ADHD. I'm sure I could talk about it a long time, but I want to just give you a few examples of real life neurodiversity. Before I do that, I just wanted to emphasize my feeling about why neurodiversity is important. I think that having an awareness of neurodiversity can improve the therapeutic alliance through the process of investigation and developing mutual understanding. What I mean by that, I mean, just talk to somebody about it. Just say, like, do you think that there's something different about you compared to other people? Let's look at these criteria together. Do we think that any of them match? And that going through that process can help you to build a better understanding of the person that you're working with. I think that it can help a person and their loved ones come to terms with the difficulties that they may have experienced in their lives. In some cases, I've seen people for whom treatment of ADHD makes a huge difference in how they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And really that, it can raise some difficult reflections on what that means, if someone's had a lot of challenges throughout their lives. I think that understanding that someone's neurodiverse can change the opinion and approaches of clinicians and their support workers. And I think that is happening both in the private and the public system as more and more people are considering whether or not these diagnoses are relevant. And importantly, I think that in some cases, the way that you're going to structure someone's recovery and treatment is going to be profoundly influenced by identifying these diagnoses if they're present. So I'm going to give you a few examples. The first one is Brittany. Now, this is the person, this is all de-identified, and I've got consent from all of them to talk about, to include their stories in this presentation. Brittany was the person that I wrote the case report about. At the time, this is years ago now, she was 21 years old and she was living with her parents. She'd been diagnosed with autism as a child and she'd had a lot of difficulty fitting in. It seemed like she had this sort of pattern in primary school where other kids looked after her. But then in high school, just awful things happened to her. It was really hard to listen to her talk about what some of the other kids did. And it seemed that from there, she developed these very high-risk suicide attempts, and it was hugely impairing on her life and had a massive impact on her family. The other person's Carl. So Carl I worked with over about 18 months. He had developed BPD symptoms after the end of a romantic relationship. He'd been treated for ADHD when he was in high school, but this was a new and very sort of dangerous situation where he was suicidal when I started working with him. And then the third person's Frank. So Frank was a 50-year-old man who had been unemployed for many years and was living in the public housing system. He had this laundry list of different diagnoses that people had used over the years. And it seemed like one would sort of seem like it fit, but then he didn't respond to the treatment in the way that people hoped. But he was coming in and out of the emergency department all the time in a state of high distress. So as I worked with Brittany, one of the things that became clear is that that she fit this picture I described earlier of having very strong language skills, but that underneath those very strong language skills were a number of areas of great difficulty, particularly in recognizing emotions in other people, being able to say when someone was sad or when they were happy. And that also leading to difficulties in navigating social interactions, and that all of that had led to this persisting feeling that she couldn't fit in, she couldn't connect with other people, and it was largely confirmed by the experience she had in high school when she was treated so horribly. Carl had had some cognitive testing done as well around the time that he was diagnosed with ADHD, and had found that he had a superior intelligence. But he could describe to me very clearly that he's had difficulties in understanding emotions in social interactions as well. He explained to me a system that he'd actually developed. It was almost like a check system where he would try and read people's facial movements, what they were saying, what they were doing, and then connect that to his previous experience of people so that he could then make a decision about how to engage with someone. And the way that he described his suicidality is that he felt that he'd reached a point where that system was no longer working. And when he reached a point where he thought that I'm not going to be able to create a system that's going to help me manage, his answer to that was, well, I can't go on living if it's going to be like this. Carl did very well in a DBT program. I was talking to Jenny before as well about the universality of DBT, and I think that in this case, working, particularly group work for Carl, was very useful to help him develop his understanding of social interactions and to get feedback from people in a safe space. Frank, I spent time with Frank, and this was in the days when I was thinking about autism a lot, and I'd started to think, okay, maybe this is a presentation of autism that's never been picked up. And I referred him along to an autism specialist assessment service in Victoria, and he was diagnosed with autism. And one of the things that came out of that assessment is that he had a number of sensory sensitivities, and he'd been saying it himself. He'd been saying, I just can't be on public transport, and my government housing is right next to a train line. And so the NDIS team got involved, and they moved him to different housing and got him a pair of noise canceling headphones to carry with him when he gets on public transport. And as far as I know, the major issues resolved. Brittany was I'm very thankful for Brittany for the time that we spent working together. She really opened my eyes. That's where all this started for me, is in working with her and realizing that the surface symptoms of BPD were really just the tip of the iceberg, that there was much, much more going on underneath. But I think that it took me years to really start to get my head around the specifics of what Brittany's strengths were and where her areas of challenge were and what she needed to scaffold those areas of challenge. And so what I arrive at the end is the same system that I described to you from the beginning. This is broadly what's in my head when I'm working with somebody who I think has significant challenges in how they feel about themselves and how they relate to the world. Is that these three areas of attachment, trauma, and neurodiversity, they have varying levels of contribution for each individual person, and that they influence each other as well. So the presence of one can alter the impact of the other, and vice versa. It's this very complex, sort of interconnected experience of consciousness, and you can't necessarily divide one from another cleanly, which is one of the things that I see people trying to do often, is to say, is this BPD, or is it trauma, or is it neurodiversity? And I think that I mean, you could say fortunately or unfortunately, it's in some cases, well, actually probably more often than not, it's all three. But I think that developing a specific understanding about each individual domain is critical to providing somebody with support interventions that fit their needs. Now, the last thing I just want to mention to complicate the picture even more is a specific digression about attachment. So some of you may recognize this photo. This is a picture of a news article about a group of children known as the Romanian orphans. So this is a really tragic story of a number of children that were born in Romania. There was a leader at the time who had outlawed contraception. And one of the downstream consequences of that is that a generation of children were born and who were given up into foster care. And some of the orphanages in which these children were housed exposed them to horrible levels of deprivation, sensory primarily, just no love and care at all. And these children, because they were the focus of quite a lot of media attention when all of this came out, had significant follow-up with research done about how they developed. And what those researchers have found is that a number of these children display traits which look like autism. And so again, for me, it comes back to this understanding that these three domains are inherently and inextricably related to each other. And that's the challenge for all of us, is to try and develop this specific understanding of the person that we're either supporting, that we're working with. And so in the end, I think that what we're describing is, at its core, it's about the genes we inherit interacting with our environment. That's really, I mean, to me, that's the core of what medicine and therapy is about understanding that we are born with this certain set of vulnerabilities, this certain way that our brains in particular work, and that set of building blocks is then influenced and shaped by our experience in the world. And I think that if we can go into working with people with this in our minds, that we at least will be curious enough to try and understand the specifics of each person. And that's the end of my talk.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Lucas. That was incredible. It certainly got me thinking about people in my life and some of my clients in a different kind of way, because I think I sent some of those questions through to you, and I was putting differential diagnosis as a category next to some of them, whereas it would my understanding from what you've said, that it's actually a case of comorbidity, which is to say two or more diagnoses are occurring at the same time, is much more common than misdiagnosis.
I mean, this is very much evolving. I think that, but certainly when I started at Spectrum, there was the general consensus is that if somebody had autism, that they couldn't have BPD. And I would say that's really been flipped on its head. That someone who has autism, I think, has a may have a vulnerability to developing BPD. Because I think it's again one of these things where autism is far more complex than I appreciated when I started. I mean, even going through sort of all this training, I felt like working with Brittany in particular was this education in what autism really is. And I think as a term, it's challenging because, as I said before, that autism is a word that's been around for 100 years, and I think that it actually is kind of reached its limits because that original set of people was a very specific set of criteria. But now we're understanding increasingly that each autistic person can have this huge variation in all these different things that a brain does. And so to say that this person, like Carly from that video, is the same as Brittany, they both have autism, it's almost a stretch, if you ask me, because the things that they have difficulty with and the things that they're very good at are completely different. I mean, Brittany, in my mind, she has very strong language, but she can't really understand social interactions in the way you or I might. Whereas Carly's understanding of social interactions is very advanced, but she can't speak. And so, are they both autism? I don't know. I think eventually probably we're going to have more specific terminology.
Yeah. And that, I guess as there was a question about, is there an increased prevalence of diagnosis, but is that not just a result of an increased understanding of, how different people's challenges present and why they may present their ways? Because as you were talking about, there are different people with autism, and I'm thinking, and there are completely different environments in which they grow up.
Yeah. And so it's immensely, again, it's just immensely complex. I mean, the increase in diagnosis, I think it's multifactorial is my read on it. You'll hear some people talk about environmental factors, which may be increasing the risk of people developing autism. I don't know. I haven't looked into that enough, but certainly I would say that there's more awareness and that people, clinicians, family members, the people themselves who are trying to access mental health care are thinking about it. They're asking the question now and saying, is this part of who I am? Does that represent autism? Does it not? And as a result of that, it's I think that more and more people are asking about whether or not a diagnosis fits.
Yeah, and sure. And I think I heard somewhere that something like 40% of people with ADHD have autism, or vice versa, or both. What are the statistics?
It's very high. It's about the stats I've seen are that it's about 50% of people with autism have ADHD as well.
Right. So that adds another level to the complexity.
It definitely does. Because it's, what we're talking about is, because when you think about autism, like when someone has a diagnosis of autism, a lot of the studies that have been done are on people with autism of level 2 or 3. And there's been brain imaging and genetic studies done, and it's very clear that there's an organic basis, like that the brains of an autistic person is different at a very fundamental sort of level from a neurotypical person. But it's not a sharp division. There's a gradient, and we don't have an effective way yet of really drawing a line, in my opinion.
Yeah, and also people's brains can change with the right stimuli.
That's right.
Yeah, which is a whole another level of complexities. So some of the questions that we had, this is always an interesting one to me, actually. In what age range do BPD symptoms tend to appear? Because that myth that BPD is something you don't have until you turn 18, it seems to be still very much out there.
Yeah, there's still a lot of stigma surrounding BPD, which I for me, it's I think it's very unfortunate. I think that we all have challenges throughout our lives in understanding who we are, in feeling good about ourselves, and in relating to other people in our lives effectively. And it's part of why, Jenny, I think DBT is universal, is because I think we're all on the same spectrum in this regard. It's just that some people have challenges that reach a point where it's such a huge impact on their life that they need professional support of some kind. But in terms of the general established stance in the mental health community now, I would consider a diagnosis as early as sort of 12, 13 years old. I'd be saying, should we make this diagnosis? But it wouldn't. I think to me, it's not a one-way street. It's not me coming in and seeing somebody and saying you have BPD. There's the door. It's a discussion. It's do we think that this is relevant? Do you have these challenges? Does this fit? And I'm quite a big fan of the complex PTSD diagnosis as well, because I find it's a very useful thing to bring into the conversation to say, okay, do you have a history of trauma, and is this a better fit? And how do we want to use these diagnoses so that we can reach an agreement about it? And it doesn't always work out that way, but.
Yeah. So how would you use that difference between complex PTSD and BPD? Well, how are they different? Because a lot of people say, oh, well, it's the same thing, but not everybody that has BPD has trauma.
It's not quite the same thing. I mean, you have to actually have PTSD to qualify for a diagnosis of complex PTSD. And that means you have to have been exposed to some sort of trauma. And you have to have this triad of invasive, sort of intrusive memories, flashback nightmares, a high level of anxiety, and very prominent efforts to avoid anything that reminds you of that trauma. So that core set of symptoms has to be there, really, for us to be able to say this is a formal diagnosis. But for a lot of people that I've seen, those symptoms are there. And then I'm just sort of using the complex PTSD and the BPD diagnoses, both of them, to sort of say, which one of these do we think is a bigger contributing factor? How are we going to sort of put this together? And in some cases, people end up with both diagnoses.
Yeah. And of course, like in the psychological world, there's a definition of trauma. And then in general society, people use trauma for all sorts of things. What's the sort of psychological criteria for trauma?
So so if you look at the DSM is quite clear that it's has to be something that involves significant physical threat of some kind or exposure to physical threat in someone else. ICD, this new sort of complex PTSD diagnosis it's not as clear. And so it really opens the door to, I think, a lot of the discussion that we're seeing happening now about, again, where the dividing line is between this type of trauma or that. And I don't know if I have the answer to that one. It's again, I think it's an area that's evolving, and because I do think that if you consider that there's very well established concepts of what trauma is, violence, accidents, things like that. But I also think that it's becoming increasingly clear that there's other types of trauma, and those Romanian orphans, I think, is a very clear example of a traumatic experience that would be much more consistent with complex PTSD. And you can see that the influence of that sort of trauma can be just as profound.
Yeah. And just to clarify, for non-technical people, the DSM is the American Psychiatric Society's definition of mental illnesses, and the ICD is the World Health Organization's definition of mental illnesses, and they approach it from quite different ways, particularly around personality disorders.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. I should be, yeah.
Expert layperson.
Yeah, no, I forget sometimes. I apologize.
It's all good. Yeah, and in fact, one of our participants has commented on, like in WA, ADHD, well, not so much ADHD, but autism is treated as something that's outside of the mental health system as well. Like it's, in a sense, like it's, our public health unit doesn't deal with autism. Someone, NDIS does that. And, this siloing of a diagnosis, like it makes it very difficult if you have to go to one service for one aspect of your personality and another service for another, I think. Do you find that's a problem?
It's hugely difficult, hugely difficult. I think that, my certainly my opinion, because I mean, the number of times that I was trying to source appropriate supports for people in the work we were doing and trying to work with NDIS specifically to make that happen. You know, I feel like I became an expert in the NDIS, which was not something I expected to be doing. But in the end, for some of the people we were working with, it was really the only solution. Like the idea that for some people that psychotherapy was going to be what they needed. I just certainly there were some people where I just didn't believe that anymore. That you know, I take Brittany as an example. I think that she really needed wraparound disability services. That was the best chance she was going to have to live the life that she might want to live. But I think that our mental health system is grappling with the frontier of mental health right now. You know, I think that Australia is way ahead of the game. I mean, because I had interactions with people from all over the world, including the States, talking about these things, and I think that Australia is much further down the road in terms of general sort of clinical awareness in the public, and in thinking about how to respond to the needs of people in a way that's effective.
Wow, that's kind of heartbreaking. having worked with families in sort of carer support roles, and how hard it is to navigate our system, to think that it could be even harder elsewhere is, yeah, genuinely heartbreaking.
No, it's a huge problem.
Yeah. So talking about families, you know, like another thing that jumped out at me from this webinar was the incredibly high heritability of you know, autism and ADHD, and also I don't think you quoted the stats, but I think is it like 60% for people with BPD as well? There's a heritability factor there, and that
About
if you
50%.
yeah, and you know, like my generation of women with ADHD, you know, it wasn't even on the radar for girls to get diagnosed. So you know, what is it like? So, yeah, so what did you observe? Did you work with families, given that there's likely to be undiagnosed adults in the household? And what did you observe there?
So, I mean, yes, over time, that was something that I was trying to think about more and more often, and certainly in the private work I'm doing now, it comes up all the time. And in part because I'll ask about it much more specifically. You know, if somebody comes in and they think they may have autism or they may have ADHD, we'll go through their family and we'll say, you know, do you notice that people around you have similar sorts of ways of engaging with others, similar sorts of challenges? And quite often it comes out that somebody may have a underlying diagnosis that would be consistent with the criteria for autism or ADHD. And I think that, you know, in some cases it's relevant in terms of thinking about how somebody grew up. And it comes back again to this idea of attachment. And if there are difficulties in social understanding or in relating to others, that would have an impact on how somebody connects with somebody else. And if that connection isn't made, you know, then you can see the same sort of attachment issues emerge, even if everyone has the best of intentions at heart. Is that you just there's something missing. It's kind of like Carly not having that computer to allow her to speak to others. There's something that's sort of trapped and walled off that you have to find a way of bridging across. But if you aren't even thinking about it, then how would you ever know?
Yeah. So, you know, it's these diagnoses are really complex, and arriving at them, I imagine, is quite a complex process. What does treatment look like? I mean, that's such a broad question, but you know,
the broad question.
Hopefully, so it looks individualized.
Yes, it has to be individualized, and I think that there's hope in individualized treatment, but there's also significant challenges because it just means more time, more resources that need to be brought into the picture. Because I don't think that you can take a one size fits all with some people. I think, you know, things like DBT, MBT, these are very effective for, I would say the majority of people that have symptoms that are consistent with BPD. But particularly if somebody seems like they're still struggling or it's not quite fitting, that's when I'd start to say, okay, like when maybe we need to think about these other things. But these days I don't even wait that long. I would screen for these sorts of things at the outset instead of making somebody go through that whole process and then coming to it later. And so it's certainly still now, and when I was at Spectrum, I had this battery of screening tests. I tried to keep them short, but just something that would potentially raise a red flag of saying there's something you need to pay more attention to here. Because in some cases, I don't think that I could have just picked up on it just from talking to somebody.
Because of that very effective masking that goes on.
Yeah, I just think that there's some things like, you know, I mean, again, it was just Brittany, like Brittany, I think a lot of people just assume that Brittany didn't have any particular challenges because of the way that she could speak to you. But then if you went and you sat down and you did sort of formal cognitive testing of any kind, it would come out very quickly. But I think that, you know, certainly in my field, you'll often see psychiatrists who will do an assessment and they'll say that, you know, cognition's grossly normal or something like that. And that's really based on an impression. You know, you're saying, okay, this person seems to understand what I'm talking about. But I don't know that that's a reliable measure.
Yeah, and especially if you know, someone, you know, they're looking through the window of their own experience as well, aren't they? And
that's it.
And given the prevalence of certain conditions within society, there's a good chance that maybe an autistic psychiatrist could be assessing autistic clients. Well, you're normal.
You nailed it, because we're not using an MRI or a CT scan. You know, we're using our own minds as the instrument here, and each of our own minds has its own biases. It's all these different things, and so it's not a truly objective measure. And that's why I hope in the longer term we're going to have objective measures. Like you'll be able to go into a clinic and you'll have it won't be somebody who's sort of asking you questions. It'll be some sort of, you'll have questions as well, but you'll also have some biological tests that will help us say yes or no.
Yep, sure. Okay, so there's some newish therapies out there like EMDR and transmagnetic stimulation, is it, or something? You know, all of those sort of those that area of treatment about which I know very little. Have they got much evidence behind them or anything that we should?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean TMS I've certainly has strong and continuing to, I mean it's quite well established TMS. So TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's basically you're using a magnet to activate certain areas of the brain. Primarily, like the strongest evidence for TMS is in depression, treatment of depression, but it has been extended more broadly. And you know, but I think that, you know, what we're looking at here is still a frontier. While we're talking, I'll put a podcast in the chat about an autistic person who had treatment with TMS, and he had a remarkable result from it because he actually was able to recognize emotions after he had TMS. I'll find it before we finish. It's fascinating. And then the other one, EMDR. So EMDR again, so eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. The basic principle of it is that it's a type of exposure therapy, meaning that you are going to help someone who's had a traumatic experience get used to thinking and reliving the experience of trauma. And what the therapist will typically do, and I certainly wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I think I know the basics, is that a therapist will use eye movements to help somebody have something else to focus on while they talk about the traumatic experience that they had. And as a result of that, I've seen some people who've had remarkable results in being able to think about the trauma without being emotionally overwhelmed. And there's quite strong evidence for EMDR as well. EMDR, I think, and EMDR in particular, I think is dependent on the individual. You know, I think if somebody had significant language problems or sort of sensory challenges that were relevant. EMDR might not be the best fit, but somebody who's had specific traumas and thought that a therapy like that might be helpful might do okay. I don't know about the literature for autism spectrum and EMDR specifically. I'd have to go look that up.
Oh. And another question that often comes up is, what's the prognosis of people with these complex, these complex presentations, like, DBT promises that, you can help build a life worth living. Do you see that? Do you see that, with the right supports in place, people can live a rich, meaningful life?
So I think, I mean, my answer is generally optimistic. I do think that people can live a rich, meaningful life, but I think that in some cases, one of the biggest things you've got to establish is what reasonable expectations are. I think one of the things that came up repeatedly for me in working with people that had the very complex challenges is that I think that there were some people that had forms of neurodiversity or they had cognitive impairments to some degree for whom the standards of a rich and fulfilling life might look different than somebody else. But I think that what we wanted to do is try to figure out where the areas of difficulty were and how we might, in a sense, plug that gap and provide the person the support that they need so that they can live a satisfying life. I think that's possible. I do. But it requires a lot of thought and in some cases quite intensive resources to provide that platform.
Yeah. And it's ironic because, some of these ADHD is not recognized on the NDIS. Autism is, BPD is not. It's, schizophrenia is if you've had it for 7 years, or, it's like we have a system that says we can have this level of support for people, and then it promises but doesn't always deliver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I think that we're just grappling with which is brand new science. It's our system is trying to catch up with what I think is an evolving understanding of the brain, because even some of that science I was talking about with consciousness earlier, like sort of those sort of tricks of the mind and all that, that's very cutting edge neuroscience. Like we're still getting our heads around what that means, because in my opinion, it's fundamental to understanding psychiatry, is that's how a brain works, and that I mean, I could go on all night so you had to sort of rein me in, but but that some of what we experience as mental health disorders may be maybe something about the way that our brain is predicting the environment that doesn't match. And so that all of this is the very bleeding cutting edge of neuroscience. And, I think our health systems and our disability systems are going to be adapting to that science as it emerges.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just going to unmute you. Lucas, can you unmute yourself? Sorry, people keep unmuting, which is not going to work for us. Can you unmute yourself, please?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Sorry, there was a setting that we probably should have put in place before. Okay, so there are also questions about trying to get people into treatment and when they're refusing, which is a question that comes up all the time. Our answer at NEA BPD would be get your help for yourself, because when family members get treatment, whether that's through a group like Family Connections, they will change the way that they interact with their person, and their person will see those changes, and you're actually modeling that therapy can change things. And it will also make it much easier for you to bear the burden of the challenges that having a loved one with challenges has. But have you, I mean, services like Spectrum, I mean, Spectrum very much supports the Family Connections program. Are there other things that they would do working with families? Do they have family therapy sessions, for example? Or?
Yeah, so Spectrum runs a family and carer workshop on a regular basis in Melbourne. I think it was, if I remember right, it was once a month. And so carers, supporters could come in and they would get some basic, well, not basic, but they would get quite advanced psychoeducation. And it was a group space as well for support in helping people think about how to navigate these sorts of challenges and in navigating the system.
Yeah.
But I would absolutely, everything you just said, I think is spot on. The other organization I'd mention in Victoria is the BPD Foundation.
Yeah, they do great work, and their website has a list of resources in each state, free government and not-for-profit resources in each state for getting help with BPD for both people with it and their family members. So definitely check out that resource. That's the BPD Foundation. I don't know. There's some very long comments that I don't have time to get to the bottom of just yet. Sorry. Okay. Well, I think I've kind of covered, because you covered a lot of the questions that were asked in the, we did have some questions around addiction, which is another interesting problem in the private sector, is that people will go, oh, you need to get your addiction sorted out before we'll sort out your personality disorder or your ADHD. When how do you separate them? It's but apparently, according to the way the public health system is set up, they can be separated. Yeah, so I think we've actually. Oh, the only other question we had was, can we explain the oversensitivity to others' emotions and reading emotions that aren't there? Is that something that you have? That BPD perception where a neutral face is an angry face. Is there is there any more research in that area or any light that you can shed on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, that's quite well established that sort of, you hear some people describe it as a negativity bias. And, basically it's I think it matches with the neuroscience, because I think that if you take something like PTSD, anxiety, all of these, in my mind, if you consider that understanding that the brain is sort of predicting your environment based on past experiences, is that may be really what's going on, is that you've been traumatized or you've had repeated experiences of negative interactions with other people. And so your brain, in a way, kind of develops this this way of predicting things that repeats itself. And so, if you've had really difficult experiences earlier in your life, then you would then say, your brain might then say, okay, I probably need to keep my guard up all the time, because that's what I've experienced. And so that's what I'm going to anticipate is going to happen again. And so I think that part of the process, particularly, when you think about therapy, like working with a therapist or doing DBT or MBT or one of these things, one of the things that I think is going on at a fundamental sort of level is that you're resetting those predictions. You're helping the person to say, okay, not everybody is going to treat me horribly. And so maybe I can, over time, I can learn to dial down that sort of emotional response. And I think that's what's going on in someone's brain at a really fundamental sort of level, is that those predictions.
Recognition.
Exactly.
Brains
exactly.
are basically pattern recognition machines. And
That's it.
you'd see that in that tile example that you showed. The pattern says that should be darker. You put it in the shaded area. We pattern recognize it into being lighter, even though it's the same piece of paper.
Yeah.
because we want the
And
pattern to
it's-
pick.
Yeah. And it's not just humans that can do this. Like this is a part of brains across lots of animals, but it's a really fundamental thing of what brains do.
Yeah. Okay.
Now,
Well,
before we go, I found
Yeah.
this podcast, so I'm going to put this in the chat. I found this podcast stunning to listen to. I found myself getting emotional listening to this person talk about their experience. So if you're in your car, something like that, I reckon it's worth a listen.
thank you. I'm copying that one myself. Hopefully it doesn't automatically start playing as I click on the link.
No, you're safe. It's just a webpage.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think yeah, look, thank you. It's so there's some questions about whether we can share resources. I'm not sure what we'll be doing with that, but definitely
I'll send a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, great. So we can distribute that to people that have registered for the webinar. There is we have a YouTube channel and we have a website where this webinar will end up. So you can watch it and rewatch it. I know that I am going to be watching it and rewatching it, and I'll even watch it through the horror of seeing myself on screen because the information that you've given us today has just been so amazing. And I know that it's changed a pattern in me in that I must admit I had a bias around, I think people are misdiagnosing people with BPD when they actually have ADHD, but I can now see that, well, if they've got 19 times the chance of developing BPD, that's likely comorbid, which is a big change, and even that, just seeing that graph of how ADHD medication can reduce suicidality, that makes chasing an ADHD diagnosis important. If all the signs are there, obviously you don't go to just get it for the hell of it. That's not
No, you got to be careful with it. But it's why I say, like, these days I would front load it. I would say, okay, do we think ADHD is there? We should treat it. And then we see what else we still need to be thinking about. Because for some people, that's it. But other people, it's not the whole answer.
Yeah. No, that's really, really fantastic information. And yeah, look, I mean, I guess it's both. You're going to do a dialectical thing here and say it's both encouraging that Australia is in some ways at the leading edge of treatment and awareness in society, and it's kind of horrifying because I'd hate for people to be experiencing something worse than this. So I think everyone that attended today is contributing to raising awareness, and write to your MP and demand better health funding for mental health in Australia because we need it. And demand better services all around, I think, because they're out there, like, certainly what's been done with Spectrum and Origin and Project Air, and there is some brilliant research being done in Australia. It's just not being generalized out yet, because we need to see that happen. So thank you, Lucas. Thank you so much for your time. That was just really illuminating. And thank you to everybody that registered. Thank you for donating. If you could afford to do that, that really just makes such a huge difference, because we're one of the things that doesn't get funded in Australia. So,
It doesn't seem right.
Yeah, it doesn't seem right. No, it really doesn't seem right, especially when it's so effective. And please, if you're a carer, please get support for yourself. It's okay, and you will be modeling self-care, which you may find that the person in your life that you want to support will also follow in your footsteps.